Today, the place that I wanted to start with is something that you may have already discussed in class, but that we call the employer-contractor distinction. So at Bunk and Brew, I've largely been referring to my team as employees, but in truth, we use both employees and contractors. And there is an important difference between the two, and the line can be fine, and in fact, it seems even more fine as of late with Uber and Lyft, as you may be following, fighting over this in California. But the basic legal definition and legal difference between the two is that, unlike an employee, an employer does not necessarily control or direct the work of a contractor. Rather, the employer hires the contractor for a job, and then the contractor determines how to complete that job. So the courts will consider a few things as well, including how integral the worker is to the employer, and likewise how dependent the worker is on the employer. For example, if, let's say, the level of control or direction isn't clear, but the worker is regularly employed by that employer, the work is essential to the employer's operations, and the client is exclusively dependent on the employer. The court may, in that case, be inclined to consider that worker an employee and not a contractor. So why does that matter? Well, the classification will determine the rights, duties, and risks as between employer and worker. So generally, an employer takes greater responsibility for an employee than a contractor and is required to comply with the requirements we discussed earlier, like minimum wage and overtime and eventually health insurance. However, a contractor is not generally guaranteed these same protections. Therefore, you can see now why Uber and Lyft are spending millions of dollars to basically classify their workers as contractors, not employees. So, as I said, at Bunk and Brew, we use both, but we mostly rely on employees, except for special cases like professional or specialty services, maybe legal, financial, construction and repair. But deciding whether or not to retain in-house or outsource isn't always clear, and sometimes you'll make mistakes and you'll even reverse your approach, and that's part of a growing business, is being nimble and being adaptable and changing things when you realize you need to. So when you start your business, you'll be inclined to do as much for yourself as you can because you'll likely have more time than money, and the less you spend, of course, the longer you'll survive. So in our case, one of the early decisions we made was, rather than outsource our laundry, we decided to purchase a fleet of residential washers and dryers and do it all in-house. We figured that if we were going to do a lot of laundry anyway and we had the space, we would just purchase extended warranties on these machines and then run them as long as they lasted, and then redeem the warranties if we needed. Well, we ended up doing a lot more laundry than expected, and more importantly, the machines didn't last as long as we had planned. So even though we were getting free repairs, we couldn't repair them fast enough to keep up with all the laundry. So in this case, ultimately, we realized that we would have been better off had we just outsourced that laundry originally until we could afford more expensive commercial machines that wouldn't break so quickly. So that was kind of a silly example, but it made a big impact on our business in the early days. The other way to think about outsourcing is as a strategic risk reduction tool. Typically, this is when the uncertainty of an outcome and the failure has a high cost. So the uncertainty is high and the cost of failure is high. And these examples would be things like facing a lawsuit, of course, responding to the IRS, and really anything that would jeopardize the health or safety of your employees or guests. So my business partner, for example, he's a pretty big DIY guy, right? And he'll attempt just about anything except for electrical. And I wasn't there when it happened, but apparently one time he got a pretty big zap, and that was it. And so now it's no question, when it's electrical, we outsource it and give it to the professionals. And that's one way that we basically divert our risk and lessen our burden.